C'est une photo de moi et de ma famille. Mon père, ma mère, Ronnie, Ricky, Randy et moi. Je n'arrive pas à croire que ces quatre-là sont partis et qu'il ne reste que nous deux. Comme je le dis souvent, les meilleurs sont partis et tout ce qu'il me reste, c'est lui. Je n'étais pas sûre de vouloir faire cette interview. C'est très douloureux de parler de tout ça. J'ai vraiment pesé le pour et le contre avant de vous rappeler. Mais j'ai décidé de le faire pour Ronnie. Il y a sans doute des membres de ma famille qui ne veulent pas que je raconte l'histoire des frères. En partie parce qu'ils ont peur. Ricky m'en veut parce que j'ai témoigné contre lui. Je l'ai fait car j'avais grandi toute ma vie avec Ricky et je savais comment il était. Je vis toujours dans la peur. Quand je sors de ma maison, je regarde autour de moi, je me dis toujours « et s'il était là ?» C'était toujours mon père qui filmait. C'est pour ça qu'on ne le voit presque jamais sur les vidéos. Nous étions en vacances en Floride. 3 garçons turbulents et moi accrochés à la main de ma mère. C'était de chouettes vacances. Vraiment très chouettes. C'était la première fois que j'allais à la plage. On a tous l'air heureux, on s'amuse. Le cadre était magnifique. C'était le temps de l'insouciance. Une famille américaine ordinaire qui menait une vie heureuse sans se douter de ce qui arriverait un jour. Ces moments me manquent. Il faut repenser au passé et aux bons souvenirs. Il n'y a pas que du malheur. Mais ça fait mal de savoir qu'ils sont tous partis, sauf lui. Cette photo a été prise dans le sous-sol de ma grand-mère à Noël, lors de la grande fête que nous organisions chaque année. Et là, c'est moi, sur les genoux de Ricky. Je devais avoir 4 ans, et lui 10. C'est l'une des premières fois qu'il a abusé de moi. Il s'était passé quelque chose juste avant dont je préfère ne pas parler. Mais on voit bien à mon expression qu'il m'a fait quelque chose. Il est assis là, tout content, alors qu'on voit sur mon visage que j'ai peur de lui. C'était une brute. Et j'étais la petite sœur qui devait supporter ça. En regardant cette photo, je ressens encore cette peur. Et ça a commencé si jeune. J'étais l'une de ses premières victimes. Je lis dans ses yeux qu'il est méchant, malveillant. Son regard me transperce. Un jour, quand j'avais environ 7 ans, je faisais la sieste sur le canapé. Je me suis réveillée et j'ai senti une odeur horrible. C'était abominable. On aurait dit un putois. J'ai remarqué que j'avais les cheveux mouillés. Ricky se tenait à environ 1 mètre de moi et me regardait fixement. Et il gloussait. Il gloussait. Je lui ai demandé ce qu'il avait fait. Il avait à la main une bouteille de leurre synthétique. C'était de l'urine de biche. Ça sert à attirer les cerfs à la chasse. Je t'en ai mis dans les cheveux. Quand je lui ai demandé pourquoi, il a répondu « comme ça ». Il n'avait pas d'explication à me donner, hormis qu'il trouvait ça rigolo. Et il riait.
Maman!
J'ai appelé ma mère pour qu'elle vienne dans le salon. Elle l'a tout de suite senti en descendant l'escalier. J'ai dit « Maman, sans mes cheveux, regarde ce qu'il a mis dedans. »
Regarde ce qu'il a fait.
Elle l'a disputé, mais c'est tout.
Je suis désolée, ma chérie. Tu vas avoir de gros ennuis, toi.
Ricky n'a pas eu à en payer les conséquences. Et j'ai senti le putois pendant 1 semaine. Il n'avait aucun remords. Rien. Rien ne semblait l'atteindre. Je pense qu'il l'avait fait pour dire « Je suis plus vieux que toi, tu vas être mon souffre-douleur, et je vais faire tout ce que je veux. Tu ne pourras rien faire pour m'arrêter. » C'était bien pire qu'un frère qui embêtait sa petite sœur. Ma mère disait que Ricky ressemblait au diable, même quand il était petit. Quand j'avais 9 ou 10 ans, nous avions un voisin chez qui j'allais me baigner tous les jours pendant l'été. J'y avais passé une grande partie de la journée quand, en fin d'après-midi, Ricky a débarqué et a sauté dans la piscine. Il est resté dans la piscine quelques minutes à me regarder et soudain, quelque chose l'a fait disjoncter. La seconde d'après, il m'a poussé au fond de la piscine et m'a maintenu la tête sous l'eau. Je ne pouvais pas reprendre mon souffle ni respirer. Il m'appuyait sur la tête et ne me laissait pas remonter à la surface. J'ai cru que j'allais mourir. La mère du voisin est sortie dans le jardin et a demandé à Ricky ce qu'il faisait. Et il a enlevé les mains de ma tête. C'était un jeu pour savoir combien de temps elle pouvait retenir sa respiration. Je l'ai regardé et j'ai dit « Menteur. C'est faux. Rentre à la maison. » Et la voisine l'a forcé à rentrer. Si elle n'était pas intervenue, je ne serais peut-être plus là aujourd'hui. Je ne l'ai jamais raconté à mes parents. J'avais peur des représailles si je leur disais ce qu'il avait fait. Qu'ils veuillent se venger de moi. De toute façon, je n'en savais rien. Peut-être que la prochaine fois, je ne pourrai pas remonter à la surface. Ricky était de plus en plus sombre, plus sinistre. Il suffisait de le regarder pour le voir, le lire dans ses yeux. On pouvait lire la colère dans ses grands yeux noirs. Un frère qui fait ça à sa sœur est simplement cruel et diabolique. Ricky était attiré par les armes, c'est certain. Je pense qu'elle lui donnait un sentiment de contrôle. Comme si rien ne pouvait l'arrêter. Comme s'il pouvait faire ce qu'il voulait.
René!
Un jour,
René!
j'étais assise dans le salon quand Ricky m'a demandé de venir voir. Je l'ai rejoint dans la buanderie et il était là, avec un fusil de chasse. Je lui ai dit, « Papa t'a interdit de faire ça, va faire ça dehors. » Ils avaient des règles et Ricky ne les respectait pas. Je lui ai demandé ce qu'il attendait de moi et il m'a dit de lui donner un chiffon. Je lui ai tendu un chiffon. Et le coup est parti. Mes oreilles ont sifflé. La balle a fait un trou dans le sol, à quelques centimètres de mon pied. Elle a ricoché, touché le plafond, et après, je ne sais pas, parce que je suis partie en courant. Il fallait que je sorte. Ricky a prétendu que c'était un accident. Il était stoïque, presque sans émotion. Pas de « je suis désolée, mon Dieu, qu'est-ce que j'ai fait ?» Rien, hormis « c'est pas bien grave ». Quand mon père est arrivé, il y a eu des cris, bien évidemment. « Je t'ai dit de ne pas faire ça dans la maison. Je te l'ai répété 100 fois. Tu dois vérifier qu'il n'est pas chargé. » Ça n'a eu aucun effet. Mes parents n'auraient pas dû le laisser toucher une arme après ça. Jamais. Ils auraient dû le priver de certaines libertés. Je n'ai rien dit à mes parents, car une fois de plus, j'avais peur que Ricky veuille se venger. Enfant, j'aurais peut-être dû leur en parler davantage. Mais je ne sais pas s'ils auraient su quoi faire. J'ai grandi avec un frère en qui je n'avais pas confiance. Pour être honnête, je n'y avais pas repensé avant ces 3 dernières années. J'ai essayé d'enfouir tout ça le plus possible, mais j'ai dû revenir sur le passé et réfléchir aux signes, car il y en avait. C'est une photo que mon père a prise de nous à Noël. Sur beaucoup de photos, on voit son trophée de chasse qu'il avait baptisé Charlie. C'était la fierté de mon père, autant que ses enfants. Dès leur plus jeune âge, mon père a initié mes 3 frères à la chasse. C'était leur truc, ils adoraient ça. J'adore les animaux. Je ne supporte pas l'idée de tuer un animal. Mais Ricky s'est pris de passion pour la chasse très jeune. À cette époque, il allait dans le jardin et dans les champs de maïs, tirer sur les lapins et les écureuils lors de ses expéditions meurtrières. Un jour, je m'en souviens, il m'a appelé pour me montrer quelque chose. Je ne voulais pas savoir ce qu'il faisait là-dedans, mais il a insisté. « Viens voir, c'est un cours de biologie. » J'ai fini par céder. Il voulait me montrer les organes d'un lapin et l'écorcher sous mes yeux.
C'est comme en biologie.
Je lui ai dit que je ne voulais pas voir ça, vraiment pas. Mais il m'a ordonné de rester et de regarder. Alors je suis restée là à regarder et ça m'a donné envie de vomir. Il savait que j'adorais les chats et les lapins me faisaient penser aux chats. Ils étaient tout doux et pour moi c'était vraiment trop. C'était beaucoup trop. Je n'arrêtais pas de détourner la tête, mais il m'obligeait à regarder. Je ne voulais pas voir ça. Ricky prenait un malin plaisir à me mettre au supplice. Ensuite, il m'a dit qu'il faisait ça depuis 21 jours d'affilée. Qu'il était en expédition meurtrière depuis 21 jours. Il s'en vantait. Je suis convaincue que sa folie meurtrière était un signe. Mais mes parents ne voulaient pas voir les choses sous cet angle, voir que c'était grave. C'était son hobby, la chasse. Et ils ne voulaient pas reconnaître que c'était pervers. Ils n'ont jamais voulu voir qu'il était pervers. Ils étaient ses parents, ils se voilaient la face. Ils savaient que Ricky était méchant. Et plein de haine, parfois. Mais ils refusaient de voir à quel point. Il était comme une bombe à retardement, et ça n'a fait qu'empirer. Ricky voulait être au centre de l'attention, négative ou positive, peu lui importait. Mes parents savaient. Ils savaient. Mon père l'a discipliné. C'était un homme sévère. Il avait grandi dans l'église ménonite. Mais je pense qu'à l'époque, on ne parlait pas de ce genre de choses. On ne faisait rien, on ne cherchait pas d'aide, on ne faisait pas de thérapie pour résoudre les problèmes de comportement. On disait, il est comme il est. Ma mère se sentait coupable. Elle disait qu'elle l'avait eu trop vite après Randy et qu'il réclamait son attention. Donc, elle se rendait responsable de ses dérives. Quand mon père punissait Ricky, comme mon frère était très difficile quand il était petit, c'était toujours un concours de cris entre mon père et lui. Ils avaient tous les deux un caractère bien trempé. Quand il est devenu adolescent, il a commencé à répondre. Il poussait mon père et le malmenait à 16 ou 17 ans. Ricky ne respectait pas mon père. Il n'a jamais respecté l'autorité. Il ne respectait pas plus ma mère, qui essayait pourtant d'être aimante et de s'occuper de lui. Elle lui a passé beaucoup de choses qu'il a faites. Mon père a fait de son mieux, mais il n'a pas non plus fait ce qu'il fallait. La réputation de Ricky, tout le monde le disait hostile et savait que c'était une brute. Tout le monde savait qu'il était colérique, incapable de garder un boulot. Ricky a été arrêté pour conduite en état d'ivresse. Il a été emmené au poste et il a donné un coup de poing au juge. La police connaissait sa réputation et il est devenu plus violent d'année en année. Quand Ronnie et Ricky étaient jeunes, ils jouaient beaucoup au baseball ensemble. Quand ils ont eu une vingtaine d'années, ils ont rejoint une équipe de softball. C'est le genre de choses que font deux frères. Sauf que bien sûr, Ricky a voulu gâcher ce qui aurait dû être une bonne expérience. Un soir, ils avaient un match. L'entraîneur, qui était un collègue de Ricky, a décidé de ne pas le laisser participer au match.
Oh, retourne sur le banc.
Ricky s'est énervé.
Qu'est-ce que tu viens de dire?
Quand il était en colère, il partait au quart de tour.
Tu te prends pour un dur?
Il vociférait, menaçait du doigt et disait que c'était comme ça et pas autrement. Ricky a proféré quelques insultes bien envoyées. Il a quitté le terrain, pris sa voiture et il s'est rendu chez Ronnie, où il savait qu'il y avait des armes. Ronnie avait deviné ce qui allait se passer et avait déjà appelé la police. Ricky a tambouriné à la porte. La femme de Ronnie a vu qu'il était énervé et a pris peur. Elle attendait un bébé à l'époque, mais elle l'a laissé entrer. Il s'est dirigé droit vers la vitrine où étaient les armes et il a pris un fusil. Il est revenu sur le terrain avec le fusil. Pour Ricky, l'entraîneur devait payer pour l'avoir laissé sur la touche. Ronnie s'est interposé et a dit « Je sais que tu es furieux » pour essayer de le calmer. « Tu vas avoir ta chance, mais tu ne peux pas venir ici avec une arme. » Ronnie a tenté de calmer le jeu et la police est arrivée. Ronnie a pris le fusil et il a dit à Ricky de rentrer chez lui se reposer. Il a expliqué aux policiers que ce n'était pas grave, qu'ils pouvaient le laisser partir. Les policiers ont accepté. Tant que Ricky partait calmement, ils ne feraient rien contre lui. Ils ont laissé son frère gérer la situation. Ronnie était le seul à avoir de l'influence sur Ricky. Il était toujours le mieux placé pour le calmer. Je ne sais pas comment il faisait, mais il y arrivait. Ronnie ne croyait jamais que Ricky irait jusqu'au bout. Il disait qu'il avait seulement besoin d'être apaisé, raisonné, calmé. C'était le rôle de Ronnie. Ronnie n'avait pas d'ennemis, à l'exception d'une seule personne. Tout le monde aimait Ronnie. hormis Ricky. Au début de cette vidéo, on dirait que Ronnie joue simplement à se rouler par terre. Et Ricky lui saute sur le dos, l'agrippe par le cou, et ça devient un peu violent. On voit bien qu'il devient agressif, alors que son frère est déjà à terre, dans une position où il ne peut pas se défendre. Il savait quand attaquer, quand mettre les mains et le bras autour du cou de son frère et lui sauter sur le dos pour le maîtriser. L'agressivité était là. Ça ne lui est pas passé en grandissant. On dirait que ça a simplement pris de l'ampleur, qu'il y a eu une escalade avec l'âge. Le fait que Ricky s'occupe de quelqu'un d'autre était vraiment surprenant. Il n'avait jamais eu d'enfant. Il n'avait pas la patience nécessaire. Mais on avait conscience de la contribution financière qu'il apportait. Le client dont s'occupait Ricky ne pouvait pas vraiment communiquer verbalement. Et il était plutôt maladroit. Il renversait des verres. Un soir, toute la famille dînait chez Ricky quand l'homme en question a renversé son verre sur la table. Quand il a vu ça, Ricky s'est mis en rogne et lui a crié dessus. « Comment tu oses? Comment tu oses faire un truc aussi bête? »
T'es débile ou quoi?
Cet homme, qui était handicapé mental, est resté là sans rien dire. Il a baissé la tête et s'est senti coupable. C'est là que j'ai vu qu'il avait un bleu au-dessus de l'œil et au niveau des poignets. Ma mère a demandé à Ricky ce qui s'était passé. Il a répondu qu'il était tombé et qu'il s'était cogné la tête sur la table basse. Quand j'ai vu les bleus autour des poignets, j'ai tout de suite eu des soupçons. J'ai pensé que Ricky l'avait attrapé par les poignets. Je n'avais pas de preuves. Je ne pouvais que supposer qu'il ne traitait pas son client comme il le méritait. Le plus douloureux pour moi, c'est que je le considérais comme un membre de la famille. Et je voyais tout l'argent que Ricky se faisait sur son dos. Je me suis dit qu'il allait continuer à le faire si l'agence n'était pas avertie. Quand ils étaient tous les deux, sans personne pour les voir, ça devait être bien pire. Quand Ricky a perdu ses clients, il a perdu ses revenus. Il n'avait pas économisé d'argent, ce qui l'a amené à être menacé de saisie. Il a débarqué chez moi, un jour sans prévenir, alors que mon mari et mon fils étaient absents et que j'étais seule avec ma fille de 8 ans. Ricky ?
J'ai ma dose. Ils vont tous mourir.
Il était menaçant. Je vais les tuer. Elles vont payer pour ça, pour ce qu'elles ont fait. Je vais les punir pour ça.
Elles ne savent pas à qui elles ont affaire.
Il était de plus en plus furieux à chaque minute. Et je n'étais vraiment pas du genre à rester assise sans rien dire. Alors je lui ai demandé de partir, de sortir de chez moi. Il s'est approché de moi, m'a pointé du doigt et m'a crié dessus. J'ai un paquet de gens sur ma liste. Et ces 2 garces, ce sont les premières. Ces garces vont mourir. Tu vois les tueries de masse à la télé? Je ferai pareil un jour.
Elles ne le savent pas encore.
Mais elles sont déjà mortes.
Je vais les tuer, je les surveille. J'en surveille d'autres, mais ce seront les premières. J'ai dit que j'avais peur pour elle et pour d'autres, car il y avait d'autres gens dont il ne me parlait pas. Je le croyais vraiment capable de mettre ses menaces à exécution. Ce n'était pas la première fois qu'il suivait ces deux femmes. Il le faisait tous les jours. Il l'a reconnue. Je ne connaissais pas leur nom. Je ne savais pas quoi faire. Il fallait l'enfermer. Le policier a dit qu'il ne pouvait pas. Menaces verbales, ce ne sont que des menaces verbales. On ne peut rien faire. Les menaces verbales sont à prendre au sérieux. Car il l'a fait. À partir de ce moment-là, ça a été l'escalade. Allô? Mon père m'a appelé en larmes. Papa? Il n'arrêtait pas de pleurer. Je lui ai dit de se calmer et de m'expliquer pourquoi il pleurait, pourquoi il était bouleversé. Est-ce que maman allait bien? Il m'a répondu, Ricky est venu ici et il m'a frappé. Il m'a battu. Je dois avoir une commotion car j'ai mal à la tête et je ne me souviens pas de tout. Je crois que j'ai perdu connaissance. Et il a ajouté, je ne veux pas qu'il ait des ennuis. Je lui ai répondu, tu sais quoi? J'en ai marre. Il va avoir des ennuis. Papa, il est de plus en plus violent. Il est temps de mettre un terme à tout ça. Ça doit s'arrêter. Tu es un homme âgé et tu es son père. Ça doit s'arrêter. Tu ne peux plus laisser couler, car la prochaine fois, il pourrait te tuer. Ou faire quelque chose à maman. Vous n'êtes plus en sécurité. J'ai appelé Ronnie et je lui ai raconté ce qui s'était passé. Et Ronnie était excédé. J'ai attendu environ 3 ou 4 jours et j'ai rappelé la police locale. Bonjour, je voudrais savoir où vous en êtes avec Ricky Brunk. J'ai demandé s'il avait été arrêté, si quelqu'un était intervenu. On m'a répondu non, que c'était le Covid. Tout était repoussé. Ils essayaient de ne pas surpeupler les prisons. Mais il fallait attendre, ça allait se passer. J'ai commencé à m'énerver. C'était une agression violente à l'égard de mon père. Qu'est-ce qu'ils attendaient? En tant qu'enfant, j'aurais peut-être dû parler davantage. En tant qu'adulte, j'ai essayé. Mais personne ne m'a prise au sérieux. J'étais soulagée d'apprendre qu'ils allaient enfin l'enfermer. Mais j'étais toujours... J'avais la sensation que quelque chose allait mal tourner. J'avais peur. J'avais un mauvais pressentiment. Ça allait le mettre en colère et il s'en prendrait à moi. Je l'ai dit à Ronnie, mais il m'a répondu qu'il n'aurait pas le courage de nous toucher. J'étais certaine du contraire.
Il n'a pas le cran de venir ici.
Je ne suis pas de cet avis. Mon fils est arrivé. Il avait quelque chose à nous dire au sujet de la semaine précédente, quand il avait aidé Ricky.
Il y a une chose que je vous ai pas dite.
Ricky avait dit plusieurs choses à mon fils quand il l'avait aidé à déménager. La première chose qu'il voulait lui expliquer, c'était pourquoi il n'était pas venu à son mariage.
Parce qu'il t'aurait étranglé.
Il a fini par dire à mon fils que s'il était allé à son mariage, il aurait tenté de m'étrangler. Vers 19h15, le 15 juin, mon téléphone a sonné. Je ne connaissais pas le numéro, mais j'ai quand même décidé de décrocher. La personne au bout du fil était l'associé de Ronnie. Il avait quelque chose à m'annoncer. Il a dit que les ambulanciers venaient de partir, mais que le shérif était toujours là. Je lui ai demandé ce qu'il essayait de me dire. Vous essayez de me dire que Ronnie est mort? Il a répondu oui. Je ne pouvais pas imaginer ce qui s'était passé et que je ne reverrais plus Ronnie. J'étais totalement effondrée. Ensuite, la femme de Ronnie m'a appelée et il a fallu que je réponde. Ses premiers mots ont été « On lui a tiré dessus. » On lui avait tiré dessus. Tout de suite, j'ai dit « Oh non, je dois y aller. Je dois raccrocher. » C'est là que j'ai appelé la police et que j'ai dit que je savais qui avait fait ça. Mon autre frère, Ricky. J'ai ajouté, je peux vous assurer que si vous allez chez lui, vous trouverez beaucoup d'armes à feu et qu'il ne se laissera pas arrêter sans résistance. Vous devez vous préparer. Cette photo a dû être prise le soir du meurtre. Je n'avais jamais vu cette photo. Je suis en colère. J'ai envie de lui dire « Tu n'es qu'un lâche d'avoir tué ton frère avec une arme à feu, simplement parce qu'il en avait marre de toi, de tes menaces et de ta violence. On en avait marre. » Son expression... Quel genre d'homme peut tuer son frère? Avoir tout le temps d'y repenser et ne pas pleurer, ni s'en vouloir ou regretter. Mais rien, aucune émotion. Simplement, c'est comme ça. Le petit Ricky est devenu un homme violent et narcissique. Un monstre qui a tué son frère. Et qui a fait des derniers mois de ses parents un véritable enfer à cause de ce qu'il a fait à Ronnie. Ricky a attendu que tous les collègues de Ronnie quittent le travail. Puis il est entré dans le bureau de Ronnie avec son mandat d'arrêt pour avoir agressé mon père. Et il y a eu une altercation verbale entre eux. Apparemment, Ronnie s'est défendu. Il n'en pouvait plus et a dit à Ricky de sortir. Mais Ricky ne voulait pas sortir. Et Ronnie en a eu assez. Alors Ronnie l'a frappé plusieurs fois. Puis, Ronnie lui a dit qu'il ne voulait plus le voir. Ricky est sorti par la porte de devant et Ronnie l'a suivi. C'était une porte vitrée. Ronnie l'a fermée à clé. Ricky est allé jusqu'à sa voiture, a pris son fusil et est revenu sur ses pas. Ronnie a tourné les talons et s'est éloigné de la porte de quelques mètres. Et Ricky lui a tiré dessus. Puis il est reparti, comme si rien ne s'était passé.
339, appelez une ambulance. Individu masculin, apparemment inconscient. Monsieur 339, il ne respire plus.
Ronnie comptait beaucoup pour moi. C'était une immense perte. Je me suis demandé comment j'allais l'annoncer à mes parents. C'est sans doute avec mon père que ça a été le plus difficile. Il m'a regardé et il a compris qu'il s'était passé quelque chose. On aurait dit qu'il savait. J'ai dit, c'est Ronnie. Il a été tué. Il a dit, par Ricky. Il savait. Et j'ai dit oui, par Ricky. Et il a éclaté en sanglots. Il a dit qu'il savait que Ricky en était capable. C'était dur. C'est ma déposition de témoin au procès de Ricky pour le meurtre de Ronnie. Je n'arrivais plus à dormir. Je faisais des cauchemars. J'avais peur qu'il s'en prenne à moi. Et je me demandais sans cesse pourquoi. Ma première pensée, chaque matin au réveil, était de me demander si tout cela n'était qu'un horrible cauchemar. Ronnie était-il vraiment mort, tué par notre propre frère? Mon soutien, mon confident, tué par notre propre frère? Je me repasse en boucle ce qui s'est passé. Le fait que Ronnie ait été tué par son propre frère et qu'il ait dû agoniser et mourir seul. À quoi a-t-il pensé? Qu'a-t-il bien pu ressentir? Il a dû se demander comment son frère avait pu tirer. Je pourrais écrire 100 pages que ça ne suffirait pas. Mais je dois me souvenir de la raison qui m'a décidé à vous parler. Cette violence, il faut y prêter attention. Si quelqu'un de votre famille agit de la sorte, vous devez le repousser. Vous devez parler et dire quelque chose. Je ne suis pas psychiatre, mais j'ai vu la colère, j'ai vu le mal, j'ai vu le narcissisme. J'ai vu comment tout le monde avait toujours tort et lui raison. J'ai vu la violence grandir, l'escalade et l'aggravation. Les forces de l'ordre doivent nous entendre. Elles doivent nous écouter pour que personne n'ait plus jamais à mourir entre les mains d'un monstre. Ronnie et moi avions une relation spéciale parce qu'on pouvait tout se dire. À propos de nos enfants, de notre mariage, de la vie en général. On s'occupait ensemble de nos parents qui vieillissaient. Chaque fois que nous avions une bonne ou une mauvaise nouvelle, quelle qu'elle soit, on la partageait. On s'appelait, on s'envoyait des messages. On ne se cachait rien. On était les meilleurs amis du monde. Le meurtre de Ronnie m'a tellement affectée que je fais de l'hypertension depuis. Mon médecin m'a diagnostiqué un syndrome de stress post-traumatique. Je manque de sommeil. Je pense avoir souffert de dépression et d'anxiété en essayant de continuer à vivre sans mon frère aîné qui m'avait toujours soutenu tout au long de ma vie. Trouver la motivation pour aller travailler, m'occuper de mes enfants et être à nouveau heureuse a été difficile. Mes amis m'ont aidé à surmonter cette épreuve. Mes enfants m'ont aidé. Les enfants de Ronnie m'ont aidé. C'est un combat, mais ça devient plus facile avec le temps. Je sais qu'il voudrait que je continue, que je profite de la vie et que je retrouve le sens de l'humour que lui et moi avions. Je dois le faire pour Ronnie. Faites-vous aider. Tournez-vous vers vos amis si vous avez vécu des circonstances similaires aux miennes. Sachez qu'il y a de l'espoir. Avec le temps, vous guérirez. Tendez la main au reste de votre famille. C'est très important. Je pense que Ricky est indifférent à tout. Je pense qu'au fond de lui, il sait qu'il ne sortira jamais, alors il fait tout pour pourrir la vie des autres. Il fait ça par rancune. C'est son dernier moyen de contrôle. Ça se résume à ça. Il veut dire à tout le monde, j'ai toujours le contrôle. Je ne suis plus la petite fille timide aux cheveux blonds qui ne lui tenait pas tête. J'ai finalement eu le courage de dire que j'en avais assez. Et je fais la même chose aujourd'hui. Je ne vais pas vivre dans la peur. Il ne mérite pas autant d'attention. Pourtant, c'est ce qu'il veut. Il veut me faire peur de sa cellule, mais ça ne marchera pas. C'est très dur d'accepter que Ronnie n'est plus là. C'est très dur. Et me dire que c'est mon propre frère qui l'a tué est encore plus dur. Il me soutenait dans tout ce que je faisais. Et il y a des jours où je me sens vraiment perdue sans lui. Je ne l'oublierai jamais. Un jour, je le reverrai. Je le sais. Mais savoir qu'il n'est plus là, ça me brise le cœur. Et penser qu'il est mort seul, et dans ces circonstances, est ce qui me fait le plus de mal. Le monde doit savoir à quel point Ronnie était une personne merveilleuse. Je dois faire ça pour lui. Je dois parler pour Ronnie. Parce que je veux que le monde sache qu'il était le meilleur des frères.
The night begins with a sound that never made it into any police report, a soft metallic click that echoed through a narrow New York apartment just after midnight, a sound so ordinary it vanished the moment it happened, yet decades later it still feels loud enough to wake the dead. In 1975, New York City did not sleep. It thrashed and breathed and burned through the dark, sirens stitching together neighborhoods that barely spoke to one another, headlines screaming about crime waves and fear, about a city losing control of itself. In the middle of all that noise, on a quiet residential block where the streetlights flickered like tired eyes, one woman's life ended without witnesses, without answers, and without mercy. Her name was Elaine Porter. She was 32 years old, a copy editor for a small publishing house in Midtown, known among her friends for her precision, her neat handwriting, the way she corrected grammar even in casual notes. She lived alone in a modest apartment, the kind of place that felt temporary even after years, beige walls, a narrow kitchen, windows that rattled whenever the subway passed underground. Elaine believed in routines. She walked the same routes, bought groceries from the same corner store, spoke to the same neighbors with the same polite half-smile. In a city defined by chaos, she tried to build predictability, and for a while, it worked. On the morning of March 18, 1975, Elaine did not show up for work. At first, no one panicked. People ran late. Subways stalled. Phones went unanswered. By noon, concern replaced indifference. By evening, the worry hardened into something colder. A coworker used the spare key Elaine had once reluctantly handed over just in case, pushed open the apartment door, and stepped into a silence that felt wrong. The lights were off. The air was stale. And on the living room floor, Elaine Porter lay motionless, her life already slipping into the past tense. The police arrived quickly, but quickly was never enough. The apartment told a confusing story. There were no signs of forced entry. No shatteurs de glace. No overturned furniture. The scene was quiet, almost respectful, as if whatever had happened there had been careful, deliberate. Elaine's body bore evidence of violence, blunt force trauma that suggested rage or desperation, but the room around her refused to cooperate with any simple narrative. This was not a robbery. Her purse sat untouched. Jewelry remained where she had left it. The killer had not come for things. The killer had come for her. In 1975, forensic science was a blunt instrument. Detectives photographed the scene, dusted for fingerprints with black powder, lifted what they could onto adhesive cards, and logged them into a system already overwhelmed by volume and limitation. Hundreds of prints were collected that year across the city, most of them smudged, partial, or useless. Elaine's apartment yielded several, some clearly hers, others belonging to friends and service workers who had legitimate reasons to be there. One partial print, lifted from the edge of the kitchen counter, was different. It did not match Elaine. It did not match anyone in the apartment building records. It was logged, tagged, and quietly buried beneath thousands of others. The investigation moved fast at first, driven by urgency and the pressure to show progress. Detectives questioned neighbors who heard nothing, saw nothing, noticed nothing unusual. They tracked down Elaine's friends, her ex-boyfriend, her colleagues. Everyone had an alibi, or at least one that couldn't be broken. Elaine was described as kind, reserved, not the type to invite danger into her home. She didn't frequent bars. She didn't bring strangers back to her apartment. The absence of a clear suspect was unsettling. It suggested either a master of restraint or a crime of opportunity, so random it bordered on meaningless. The city, however, had little patience for mysteries without spectacle. Another murder slid into the newspapers, given a few paragraphs between larger, louder stories. Woman found dead in East Side apartment. One headline read, stripped of context, drained of humanity. As weeks passed without an arrest, attention drifted. Detectives were reassigned. Leads dried up. The case file grew thicker, then colder. Elaine Porter became a statistic, another name in a ledger of unresolved violence that defined New York in the 70s. Years passed. The city changed. Crime rates rose and fell. Mayors came and went. Elaine's mother aged in a quiet house upstate, her daughter's bedroom left untouched, dust gathering on trophies from a life that would never continue. Every few years, she would call the police, asking if there was anything new. The answer was always the same, delivered gently, apologetically, as if tone alone could soften the truth. No, ma'am. Nothing yet. Inside the police department, Elaine's file was moved from shelf to shelf, from office to storage, its paper yellowing, photographs fading. Detectives who had worked the case retired, died, or forgot details they once knew by heart. The partial fingerprint remained inside, a silent witness that no one could hear. It existed in a world without databases, without digital comparison, without the ability to speak beyond the limits of ink and paper. By the late 80s, the case was officially classified as a cold case, a term that sounds clinical but carries a particular kind of grief. Cold cases are where hope goes to hibernate. They are not dead, but they are not alive either. They wait in the dark, dependent on chance, on technology, on someone caring enough to look again. Elaine's case waited longer than most. The first real shift came not with fanfare, but with policy. In the late 90s, New York began digitizing old records, converting fingerprints into searchable data, feeding decades of analog evidence into machines designed to recognize patterns no human ever could. It was slow, expensive work, often criticized as symbolic rather than practical. But symbols matter. And sometimes, so does patience. Elaine's fingerprint card was scanned like thousands of others, its partial ridges translated into numbers and probabilities. For years, nothing happened. The system churned quietly, comparing, discarding, matching, and rejecting with mechanical indifference. Detectives rotated in and out of the cold case unit, occasionally glancing at Elaine's file, occasionally wondering what it would take to wake it up. The answer, it turned out, was time itself. In the early 2000s, a man was arrested on a minor charge, processed routinely, his fingerprints taken and uploaded without ceremony. He paid a fine, served a short sentence, and returned to his life. No one noticed the connection then.
No alarme sounded.
The system simply stored his data, waiting. Decades after Elaine's death, long after the city had stopped asking who killed her, an algorithm flagged something unusual. A partial match. Not perfect, not definitive, but close enough to demand human attention. The print from a kitchen counter in 1975 shared enough characteristics with a modern record to raise a question that had not been asked in years. Could this be something? Could this be real? When the alert reached the cold case unit, it landed on the desk of a detective who had learned to distrust miracles. He had seen too many false starts, too many breakthroughs that dissolved under scrutiny. Still, he opened the file. He studied the print. He read Elaine Porter's name, a name he had never heard before, and felt the faint pull of a story unfinished. The past, it seemed, was knocking, quiet but insistent. Before any announcements, before any arrests, the detective walked to the evidence room, requested the original fingerprint card, and held it in his hands. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the ridges were still there, stubborn as ever. This print had survived budget cuts, reorganizations, floods, and forgetfulness. It had outlasted the people who collected it. It had waited. Outside, New York roared on, unaware that a ghost from 1975 had just cleared its throat, ready to speak at last. The fingerprints sat under fluorescent light like a challenge, a pale relic of a night no one wanted to remember, and yet it was impossible to look away. The detective ran his thumb along the edge of the evidence card, feeling the brittle resistance of paper that had survived fires, floods, and the steady erosion of institutional memory. In the 70s, this print had been a dead end, an orphan without a name. Now it breathed again, not loudly, not confidently, but enough to disturb the still air of the cold case office. Enough to demand attention. The system had produced a candidate, a man whose name had never once appeared in Elaine Porter's file. His record was unremarkable in the way many dangerous lives are unremarkable: petty arrests, bar fights, a dismissed charge for breaking and entering, nothing that would have placed him on a homicide detective's radar in 1975. He lived 3 subway stops away from Elaine's apartment at the time, a coincidence that meant everything and nothing in a city like New York. Back then, he had been invisible. Now, he had a shape. The detective didn't rush.
Col de case punichaste.
He pulled city directories from the archives, the thick books that smell like dust and ink, pages yellowed by decades of neglect. He traced addresses with a fingertip, matching years to locations, mapping lives that once overlapped unknowingly. The man's name appeared in the 1975 directory, listed as a tenant in a building less than a mile from Elaine's. Close enough to walk. Close enough to know the rhythms of the block, the flicker of streetlights, the sound of footsteps at night. He requested employment records next, the kind that often vanish with time. A small miracle surfaced: payroll slips from a defunct maintenance company contracted to service several residential buildings in Elaine's neighborhood. The man had worked there briefly in early 1975, performing repairs, changing locks, fixing leaks. He would have carried keys. He would have known which doors stuck, which windows rattled, which tenants lived alone. The absence of forced entry in Elaine's apartment began to feel less mysterious, more deliberate. Still, suspicion is not proof, and the detective knew better than to let coincidence harden into certainty. He needed to hear voices from the past, even if those voices were tired, reluctant, or distorted by time. He tracked down former neighbors, people now scattered across the country, some retired to warmer climates, others still clinging to the city out of habit rather than love. Phone calls were met with surprise, confusion, and occasionally anger. Why bring this up now? Why reopen wounds that had scabbed over decades ago?
One woman remembered Hélène vaguely, the key editor with the polite smile.
She also remembered a man doing repairs in the building around the time of the murder. He was friendly, she said, then paused, as if testing the word.
Too friendly, Meb.
Always asking questions. Who lived where? Who worked late? At the time, it hadn't seemed suspicious.
In retrospect, everything does.
Another neighbor recalled hearing footsteps in the hallway late one night, the sound of keys jangling, a door opening softly. He had assumed it was the super, or a tenant coming home drunk. New York was full of sounds like that, meaningless in isolation. Only now did they begin to align, like stars forming a shape long after the light that created them had left. The detective returned to the fingerprint, consulting forensic specialists who spoke in cautious tones. The match was strong, they said, but partial prints are treacherous. They require context, corroboration, something to anchor probability to reality. He needed more. He needed to place the man inside Elaine's apartment, not just in the neighborhood, not just in the building. He needed to understand motive, opportunity, the invisible thread that connects two lives before it snaps. He dug into Elaine's world next, searching for intersections that might have gone unnoticed. Her journals, preserved by her family, revealed little beyond daily routines and quiet frustrations. She wrote about deadlines, subway delays, the cost of groceries. No mention of threats.
Nos confessions of fear.
But one entry, dated a week before her death, stood out in its mundanity. Maintenance again today, she had written. Same guy. Fixed the sink. Asked too many questions. Probably harmless. The word sat there, unassuming, devastating.
The detective closed the journal slowly.
In that moment, the distance between 1975 and the present collapsed. Elaine's voice reached across time, unfiltered, unguarded, and accused no one directly, yet implicated everything. The same guy. Asked too many questions. Probably harmless. Probability, it seemed, had finally shifted. Still, the law demands more than narrative coherence. It demands evidence that survives scrutiny, evidence that can stand in a courtroom decades after the fact. The detective sought out the man, now in his 70s, living quietly in a borough that had changed names and faces around him. Surveillance revealed nothing dramatic. He walked his dog. He bought groceries. He waved to neighbors who knew nothing of his past. On the surface, he was invisible again, folded neatly into the city's background noise. An interview was arranged, careful, non-confrontational. The man seemed surprised by the visit, then amused. He denied knowing Elaine Porter, denied ever entering her apartment outside of official work. His memory of the 70s was vague, conveniently so. When asked about the maintenance company, he shrugged. Long time ago, he said. I worked a lot of places. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, age or something else, impossible to tell. The detective watched closely, noting pauses, deflections, the way the man avoided specifics. None of it was illegal. None of it was enough. When the fingerprint was mentioned, the room shifted. The man's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in calculation. He asked how something so old could matter now. He asked if mistakes happened. He asked if the city really wanted to chase ghosts instead of dealing with real crime. The questions came fast, defensive, rehearsed. After the interview, the detective sat alone, replaying the conversation in his mind. He had expected anger, denial, maybe even confession. What he got instead was something colder, confidence born of time. The man had lived for decades without consequence. He had learned the rhythm of forgetting. He believed, perhaps rightly, that history was on his side. But history has a way of circling back, and the detective was not done. He sought physical evidence next, a near impossible task so many years later. Elaine's apartment building had been renovated, repainted, reimagined. Nothing remained of the original fixtures. But one thing had survived, a storage unit in the basement, sealed and forgotten, containing old maintenance logs and discarded hardware. Among them, a set of keys labeled only by apartment numbers, relics of a system long replaced. Forensic testing on the keys yielded nothing definitive, but the logs placed the man in Elaine's building on the day of her death, assigned to routine maintenance. Routine. The word echoed uncomfortably.
Routine ist ça au Monsterside.
Routine is how violence slips through unnoticed. The detective compiled everything into a new file, thicker than the old one, layered with modern analysis and ancient testimony. He knew what came next would be slow, bureaucratic, uncertain. Prosecutors would hesitate. Defense attorneys would attack memory, methodology, motive. They would say the city was desperate for closure, that technology had overreached, that coincidence had been mistaken for guilt. As the file moved upward through the system, Elaine's mother passed away, never knowing how close the truth had come to the surface. Her death added a weight to the investigation, a sense of borrowed time. Justice delayed had become justice denied, and yet the detective pressed on, driven by something beyond duty. He felt watched by the past, judged by it. Late one night, alone in his office, he reopened Elaine's journal and read the line again. Same guy. Asked too many questions. Probably harmless. The words no longer felt naive. They felt tragic. They felt like the quietest warning imaginable, one that had gone unheard for decades. Outside, the city pulsed, indifferent as ever. Inside, a forgotten fingerprint tightened its grip on the present, refusing to be ignored. The case was no longer cold in the way it once had been. It was restless now, impatient, demanding an answer equal to the time it had spent waiting. The prosecutor's office smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet, a place where enthusiasm went to be sanded down into caution. The detective laid the file on the table anyway, its weight thudding like a statement. Decades of silence pressed between the covers.
Fingerprint analysis. Maintenance log.
Witness recollections frayed by time but still sharp at the edges. A life interrupted in 1975, waiting for someone to decide whether it still mattered. The prosecutor listened, expression unreadable, fingers steepled, eyes drifting occasionally to the window where the city moved on without permission. Cold cases are always a gamble, the prosecutor said finally.
Jury don't like ghosts.
Defense attorneys love decades. Memory fades.
Évidence dégradée.
Reasonable doubt grows stronger with every passing year. They agreed on one thing, more corroboration. Something that could tether the fingerprint to violence, not just proximity. Something that could explain why a maintenance worker would cross the invisible line from access to murder.
Motive.
The most elusive word in the file. The detective returned to Elaine Porter's life, digging deeper, turning over stones already overturned. Her colleagues at the publishing house had mostly retired, some passed on, but a few remained reachable. Conversations drifted from polite reminiscence into uncomfortable territory. Elaine had been private, they said, but not isolated. She had turned down an invitation from a man she described only as creepy a few months before her death.
No name.
No details. Just a discomfort she couldn't quite articulate. Another coworker remembered Elaine mentioning someone who lingered too long in doorways, asked questions that felt personal. She laughed it off, the coworker said. Said it was just New York being New York. The city teaches you to normalize unease. It teaches you to survive by minimizing fear. The detective compared timelines, dates, scraps of anecdote. The maintenance worker's employment overlapped with Elaine's complaints. The building logs confirmed repeated visits to her apartment for minor issues that never quite seemed resolved. A sink that leaked again. A door that stuck. Problems small enough to invite return visits, each one a chance to learn more, to push boundaries incrementally. He consulted behavioral analysts, experts in crimes that hide behind routine. They spoke about familiarity breeding entitlement, about predators who test limits under the guise of service.
Access without suspicion. Authority without scrutiny.
The analyst's words fit too neatly, like a key sliding into a long-unused lock. Still, theory is not evidence. The detective needed something tangible, something the defense couldn't dismiss as narrative construction. He revisited the original crime scene photos, grainy black and white images that captured a frozen moment of chaos. Elaine lay where she had fallen, the room orderly except for the violence itself. No sign of struggle beyond the final act. No overturned furniture. No forced entry. It suggested surprise, or trust, or both. A forensic consultant noticed something overlooked in 1975, faint marks on Elaine's wrists, not restraints exactly, but pressure points consistent with someone holding her arms briefly, controlling, efficient. Not rage. Not panic. Control implies confidence. Confidence implies familiarity with the space, with the victim's reactions. A stranger breaking in would expect resistance. Someone who believed he belonged would not. The detective felt the case tightening, threads converging. He requested a warrant for the suspect's DNA, a long shot but necessary. The man refused voluntarily, citing rights he had clearly rehearsed. The warrant took weeks, then months, bogged down in legal hesitation. When it finally came through, The sample yielded nothing conclusive. No DNA from the scene had survived well enough to compare. The fingerprint remained the star witness, alone but stubborn. The defense seized on that absence immediately, leaking word through back channels.
No DNA. No confession.
Just an old print and stories. The prosecutor hesitated again, weighing the risk of a public failure against the quiet comfort of leaving the past alone. But the detective pushed back, reminding them that justice is not a popularity contest. It is a reckoning, however late. Then, unexpectedly, the phone rang. The call came from a woman in Florida, her voice thin but steady. She had seen a news brief about the reopened case, recognized the name, felt a chill she couldn't ignore. She had dated the suspect briefly in the late 70s. He had been charming at first, she said, attentive in a way that felt flattering until it didn't. He asked invasive questions. He showed up unannounced. He became angry when she set boundaries. One night, after an argument, he had grabbed her wrists hard enough to bruise, held her still while telling her to calm down. She had left him the next day and never looked back. At the time, she hadn't reported it. It was the 70s. Things like that were handled privately, if at all. Now, decades later, she felt a responsibility she couldn't quite name. The detective listened, heart-pounding, recognizing the pattern snapping into focus. Wrists. Control. Familiarity. He asked if she would be willing to testify. There was a long pause. Then she said yes. Her statement didn't prove Elaine's murder, but it established behavior.
It gave shape to the man behind the fingerprint.
It suggested that what happened in that apartment was not an aberration, but an escalation. The prosecutor reviewed the new information, the case file swelling again. Reluctance gave way to resolve, cautious but real. They decided to move forward, to present the case to a grand jury and let them decide whether the past deserved a trial. News of the impending indictment leaked, as it always does. Reporters circled, hungry for a narrative that combined nostalgia and shock.
A forgotten fingerprint. A trusted maintenance worker.
A city confronting its own neglect. The suspect's neighbors reacted with disbelief. He was quiet, they said. Polite. He walked his dog every morning.
Monsters, it turned out, it's just like everyone else.
The arrest came early, deliberately unceremonious. No sirens. No cameras allowed inside. The man was handcuffed in his living room, the television murmuring in the background. He did not resist. He asked again how something so old could still matter. No one answered. In the holding cell, he sat alone, staring at his hands. Hands that had fixed sinks, changed locks, held wrists. Hands that had left a single stubborn impression behind.
The detective watched from behind the glass, feeling no triumph, only a heavy sense of inevitability.
This was not victory. It was acknowledgement. As the case moved toward trial, challenges multiplied. Motions to suppress the fingerprint. Arguments about chain of custody. Attacks on witness credibility. The defense painted the investigation as a product of modern obsession, a city desperate to rewrite its past. The prosecutor countered with science, with pattern, with the quiet consistency of facts that refused to disappear. Elaine's surviving relatives were notified, invited to attend proceedings if they wished. Some declined, unable to reopen the wound. Others came, sitting stiffly in the gallery, faces carved by time and unresolved grief. For them, the trial was not about punishment. It was about recognition. About saying her name out loud again in a room that mattered. The detective testified, voice steady, recounting the journey from dusty archive to courtroom. He spoke about the fingerprint, about the maintenance logs, about the journal entry that had haunted him. He avoided speculation, stuck to what could be proven. When asked why he believed the case deserved reopening, he answered simply, because the evidence asked to be heard. Outside, public opinion wavered. Some hailed the prosecution as long overdue justice. Others called it a witch hunt. The city argued with itself, as it always does, uncomfortable with the idea that time does not erase responsibility. As the trial date approached, the detective felt the familiar tension of waiting, the knowledge that control ends at a certain point. The story now belonged to others, jurors, lawyers, the slow machinery of the law. He returned one last time to the cold case office, to the shelf where Elaine's original file still sat, thinner than it had been, but no longer alone. He placed his hand on the folder, a quiet gesture, and wondered what Elaine would think of all this. Of a city finally looking back. Of a fingerprint that refused to fade. Of a truth emerging not in a blaze of certainty, but in fragments, assembled by people who refuse to forget. The past, he realized, is never really gone. It waits. It watches. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, it speaks again, demanding to be answered. The courtroom air was stale, conditioned into neutrality, scrubbed of emotion the way institutions try to scrub history. Wood benches polished by generations of waiting bodies creaked as people settled in, the gallery filling with journalists, retirees, a few law students, and Elaine Porter's remaining family members, their faces drawn tight as if bracing for impact. Outside, New York moved at its usual ruthless speed, but inside this room time slowed, thickened, folded back on itself. A 1975 murder was about to be spoken into the present tense. Jury selection took days. Potential jurors were asked whether they believed justice could still be served after 40 years, whether memory could be trusted, whether a single fingerprint could outweigh a lifetime of normalcy. Some said no and were dismissed. Others hesitated, then nodded. They were sworn in carrying their doubts like extra baggage, invisible but heavy. The prosecution opened with restraint, resisting the temptation to dramatize. This was not a story, the prosecutor said, but a sequence of facts neglected too long. She spoke of Elaine Porter not as a symbol, but as a person, 32 years old, editor, neighbor, daughter. She described the apartment, the locked door, the absence of forced entry. She held up an enlarged photograph of the fingerprint, ridges and loops magnified into a stark map. This, she said, is not a coincidence. This is contact. This is presence. The defense countered with a practiced calm. They acknowledged the tragedy, then gently dismantled the prosecution's certainty. Maintenance workers leave fingerprints, they argued. That is their job. Memory is unreliable. Witnesses change.
Évidence de quai.
The state, they said, was asking the jury to bridge decades with assumptions. Reasonable doubt, they reminded them, grows naturally with time. As testimony began, the detective took the stand again, this time under the harsher light of cross-examination. The defense probed every gap, every decision made long after the fact. Why reopen now? Why trust a fingerprint processed with outdated methods? Why believe a former girlfriend's account after all these years? The detective answered steadily, acknowledging limitations without conceding truth. Cold cases are built from fragments, he said. That does not make them false. It makes them hard. The fingerprint expert followed, explaining the reanalysis process in careful detail, translating science into plain language. Points of comparison. Probability. Error rates. The defense tried to muddy the water, suggesting contamination, mishandling, human bias. The expert did not rise to the bait. Science, she said, does not remember. It measures. Then came the witness from Florida. She walked slowly to the stand, shoulders squared, eyes fixed ahead. She spoke about charm curdling into control, about questions that felt like inspections, about hands tightening on her wrists. The defense objected, citing relevance. The judge allowed it, narrowly.
Pattern, note proof. Contexte, note conclusion.
Her voice did not shake. She described leaving bruised and ashamed, telling no one, filing it away as something survived. When asked why she came forward now, she paused. The courtroom went quiet in that way that feels almost physical, a collective holding of breath. Even the defendant looked down, jaw clenched, fingers interlaced too tightly. Elaine's journal was entered into evidence next. A forensic linguist testified about stress indicators in writing, about how language shifts under fear. The defense argued interpretation, subjectivity. The prosecution pointed to timing, to the escalation. The words were Elaine's. They carried her unease across the years intact. Day after day, the past was reconstructed piece by piece, not as a neat arc but as a mosaic of small truths. The jury listened, took notes, watched faces.
Outils de Courtoise, headline Grubolde. Cold Case Trial Grip City. Forgotten Fingerprint Text Center Stage.
Public interest surged, opinion split. Talk radio argued late into the night. The defense's strategy became clearer as the trial progressed: humanize the defendant, emphasize the ordinary. Friends testified about his reliability, his kindness, his decades without incident. A former supervisor described him as punctual, respectful.
The implication ogni vie in the air. Monsters do not gintu nebor.
They do not blend. They do not become unremarkable. The prosecution responded not with outrage, but with quiet insistence. Predators, they said, often do blend. They rely on routine. They hide behind access and expectation. One act of violence does not require a lifetime of it. Sometimes it requires only opportunity and the belief that no one will look too closely. As closing arguments approached, the tension sharpened.
Helene's family sat closer together.
The defendant's hands shook slightly when he drank water. The detective watched from the back, feeling the familiar helplessness of having done all he could. The prosecutor's closing was measured, almost understated. She spoke of responsibility, of listening to evidence without nostalgia or fear. She reminded the jury that time passing does not absolve action. She returned, finally, to the fingerprint. This print, she said, was left behind when the truth had no voice. Today it speaks. The defense closed with a warning. Do not convict a man on memories and maybes, they urged. Do not let the desire for closure override the standard of proof. They painted the case as a cautionary tale about hindsight and regret. The defendant, they said, deserved the benefit of doubt that time creates.
The jury deliberated for 2 days.
2 days of silence punctuated by speculation.
2 days where the city waited, uneasy, uncertain what it wanted the answer to be.
Reporters camped outside, microphones poised. Elaine's family avoided cameras, retreating into private hope. Inside the jury room, arguments rose and fell. Some jurors fixated on the fingerprint, its stubborn clarity. Others worried about precedent, about what it meant to reach back so far. They revisited testimony, reread notes, requested transcripts. They argued about trust, about fear, about what justice looks like when it arrives late. On the third morning, they reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, everyone standing as the jury filed in. The defendant stared straight ahead, face pale, eyes glassy. Elaine's sister clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. The detective felt his pulse in his ears. The foreperson stood. The clerk asked the question that had waited 40 years. Guilty.
The word landed without drama, without flourish.
Just a sound, heavy and final.
A sob escaped from the gallery.
The defendant closed his eyes, shoulders sagging as if something essential had been removed. The judge thanked the jury, voice steady, then set a date for sentencing. Outside, cameras flashed, questions shouted. Do you feel justice was served? What does this mean for other cold cases? The prosecutor declined comment. The detective slipped away through a side door, needing air, needing distance. Sentencing came weeks later. Victim impact statements were read, voices cracking but resolute. Elaine's sister spoke about absence, about holidays marked by an empty chair. She did not address the defendant directly. This, she said, is for Elaine. Not for you. The judge imposed a lengthy sentence, citing the gravity of the crime and the persistence of evidence. The defendant was led away, an old man now, the ordinary life he had built collapsing into a single irreversible truth. In the days that followed, the city moved on.
Another headline replaced the last.
But something subtle had shifted. The cold case unit received new calls, new tips. Forgotten files were reopened. A fingerprint technician stayed late, re-examining an old card with fresh eyes. The detective returned to his office, to the shelf where Elaine's file now sat stamped and complete. He did not feel triumph. He felt a quiet, complicated relief. Not closure.
Accountability.
At night, he thought about the thin line between forgetting and forgiving, about how easily time erodes urgency. Elaine's case had waited patiently, a silent accusation. It had taken science, stubbornness, and a woman's courage to answer it. Cold cases, he knew now more than ever, are not cold. They are dormant. They hold their breath. And when they wake, they remind us that the past is not behind us. It is beneath us, supporting every step, demanding that when it speaks, we listen. The sentence did not end the story. It only shifted its weight. When the courtroom emptied and the cameras packed away, New York inhaled and returned to motion, but the case did not dissolve into history the way people expected it to. It lingered, vibrating beneath conversations, resurfacing in precinct briefings, journalism classrooms, and quiet kitchens where the evening news replayed the verdict one more time. A cold case solved does not close a door. It opens 100 others. Within days, the cold case unit's phone lines lit up. Tips arrived not just about Elaine Porter, but about other names buried in filing cabinets, other faces faded in black and white photographs. People who had lived with secrets suddenly wondered if time had run out on silence. The detective watched the surge with a mix of hope and caution. Momentum can be dangerous. Not every memory leads to truth. Not every forgotten print belongs to a killer. But something had changed. The city had been reminded that the past could still reach out and grab the present by the collar. Inside the department, the verdict sparked uncomfortable reflection. Supervisors convened meetings. Evidence storage protocols were reviewed. Boxes once considered obsolete were re-evaluated. The detective returned to the evidence room one evening, long after the building had emptied. He stood in the fluorescent hum, scanning rows of boxes stacked like forgotten chapters. Elaine's case had taught him that patience can be as powerful as persistence. He pulled a random file, opened it, flipped through brittle pages. Names. Dates. Addresses that might not exist anymore. Each file was a question mark, suspended in paper and ink. Across town, Elaine's sister tried to learn how to live after resolution. For decades, grief had been an open wound. Now it was a scar, tight and unfamiliar. She visited the apartment building one last time, standing across the street, watching strangers come and go through the same door her sister had walked through for the final time. The building had been renovated, the bricks scrubbed clean, but she could still see it as it was in 1975. Closure, she realized, was not peace. It was permission to stop waiting. The defendant's appeal was filed quietly, as expected. Legal language challenged the admissibility of evidence, questioned expert testimony, argued procedural error. The defense framed the conviction as a symptom of public pressure, of a system eager for redemption. The prosecution prepared its response with the same methodical calm that had carried the case through trial. Appeals are part of the process, the detective reminded himself. Justice does not end at a verdict. It is tested there. Media coverage shifted tone. Early stories had reveled in shock.
Now comes the 5 pièces. Canol évidence bitrusted.
The ethics of cold case prosecutions. Academics debated standards. Civil rights advocates warned against the romance of delayed justice. Families of unsolved victims wrote letters to editors, asking why their cases still sat untouched.
The conversation grew large den Hélène, large den one fingerprint.
It became about time itself and what society owes its dead. In the lab, the fingerprint expert received requests from departments across the state. Old cards were shipped in padded envelopes, each one a fragile artifact. She approached them with care, aware of the weight they carried. A match is never just a match. It is a collision between then and now, between who someone was and who they became. She documented every step, double-checked every conclusion. Precision was the only defense against doubt. One afternoon, she called the detective with a preliminary hit from another case. Not Elaine's. An unsolved assault from 1978. Partial print, long ignored, now aligned with a man still alive, still local. The detective closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the implication. Another door opening. Another life about to be re-examined under harsh light. The arrest came weeks later, quieter than Elaine's. No cameras. No crowd. Just a knock on a door and a stunned expression. The suspect denied everything. Of course he did. The process began again, slow and careful. The detective felt the familiar tension between urgency and restraint. Each cold case carried the risk of re-traumatizing families, of resurrecting pain without resolution. But silence, he had learned, was its own cruelty. Elaine's journal was returned to her family after sentencing. The sister held it like something alive, tracing the indentation of words pressed hard into paper. She read passages she had never seen before, moments of joy between the fear. Elaine had loved fiercely, argued passionately, worried excessively. The journal was not evidence anymore. It was a voice reclaimed. At a community forum organized by a local university, The detective was asked to speak. He stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of students, activists, retirees. He talked about the mechanics of cold cases, the limitations, the miracles. He talked about patience, about humility, about the danger of certainty. Someone asked him if he believed all cold cases could be solved. He paused. "No," he said, "but I believe all of them deserve to be heard." After the forum, a woman approached him, hesitant. She said her sister had disappeared in 1981. No body. No arrest. Just rumors and a police report that gathered dust. She handed him a folded piece of paper with a name written on it.
À maintenant Sworker.
The detective did not promise anything. He never did. But he took the paper. He always did. The appeal hearing was scheduled for the following spring. The defendant, now thinner, grayer, sat silently as lawyers argued technicalities. The judges listened, impassive. Months later, the ruling came down.
Conviction upheld. The fingerprint analysis met standard.
The testimony was admissible. The past, it seemed, had held. When the news broke, it barely made the front page. The story had lost its novelty. But for Elaine's family, it mattered. It meant the ground beneath the verdict was solid. It meant no more waiting for a phone call that might undo everything.
Late one night, the detective walked past the river. The city lights fractured on dark water.
He thought about how easily Elaine's case could have stayed buried. One overlooked card. One assumption that the answer was gone. He thought about the stories that would never be told, the evidence that had truly vanished. Justice, he knew, was uneven. It arrived for some and not for others. That truth did not negate its value. It sharpened it. In his office, he pinned a new list to the board. Names without endings. Dates without explanations. He did not see them as burdens. He saw them as conversations paused mid-sentence. Cold cases are not about the past, he realized. They are about whether the present is brave enough to listen. Somewhere in a box in a drawer, in a database not yet imagined, answers waited. Not all of them, but enough to matter. Enough to remind a city that time does not erase truth. It only tests whether anyone is still willing to look for it. The city did not announce what came next. It never does. It moved forward in inches, in memos and late-night calls, in the soft clatter of evidence carts rolling across tiled floors. After the appeal was denied, the cold case unit felt the shift before anyone said it out loud. Doors that had stayed shut for decades began to open, not all at once, not cleanly, but enough to let the draft in. Old cases were pulled, dust shaken loose, assumptions re-examined with the quiet suspicion that certainty had been premature. In the evidence room, the detective worked with gloves on, even when policy didn't require it. Habit. Respect. He lifted lids and found time staring back at him. Polaroids curled at the edges, typewritten reports stamped received, envelopes yellowed like teeth. The past had a smell, a texture, a weight. It resisted being handled.
It demandait patience. One box bore à label written in fading marker. 1975, 1979, MISC.
Prints.
No name. No case number.
Just a year range and a shrug. He opened it and felt the familiar thrum. Cards stacked unevenly. Partial loops and whirls inked too dark, too light. Smudges once dismissed as unusable. He flipped through slowly, not hunting for a miracle, just listening for the hum of something unfinished. Every card was a question that had been asked once and abandoned. The lab took deliveries in batches now. The fingerprint expert logged each card, scanned what could be scanned, flagged what might survive enhancement. She had learned not to fall in love with a maybe. Enhancement is not resurrection. It is a negotiation with damage. Sometimes the paper wins. Sometimes the ink does. Sometimes a ridge lifts itself out of noise like a whisper finally heard. News of the expanded review leaked. It always does. A reporter called it the second thaw, a phrase that spread faster than anyone intended. Families watched from their living rooms, clutching photographs that had outlived hairstyles and fashions. Some felt hope crack open. Others felt dread. A reopened case means reopening wounds. It means answering questions you've learned to live without. At a diner in Queens, a A retired patrolman watched the segment with his coffee going cold. He remembered walking beats in the late 70s, remembered names he'd written in notebooks that never made it into official files. He told himself memory is unreliable. He told himself he was done. Then he folded the napkin in half and wrote a name anyway, pressing hard as if pressure could make it truer. He mailed it the next morning without a return address.
The detective read the letter déslaté.
The name rang a bell he couldn't quite place. He checked old rosters, precinct logs, arrest cards.
The bell grouloudait.
A man who'd been questioned once, briefly, then released into the current of the city. No print on file. No follow-up. The detective circled the name and pinned it to the board, not as a suspect, not as an answer, but as a sound worth hearing again. Another case surfaced, this one anchored to a winter night in 1976. A woman found in a stairwell, purse intact, keys missing, a single partial print lifted from a metal railing. Back then, the print had been deemed too degraded. Now the lab flagged it as borderline viable.
Borderline is where hope lives and dies.
The fingerprint expert worked late, the lab quiet except for the low whine of machines. She adjusted contrast, filtered noise, traced ridges with a steadiness learned through disappointment. A pattern began to cohere, not enough to declare victory, enough to ask a better question. She ran it through the system and waited. Waiting is the longest part. The system returned a shortlist. Not a match. Candidates. Men with ordinary names and complicated histories. One candidate lived upstate, another in Florida, a third in Brooklyn, 5 blocks from where the woman had died. Proximity is not guilt.
Coincidence is not innocence.
The detective took the file home and read it at the kitchen table while the city slept. He imagined walking those blocks in 1976, imagined the cold, the smell of damp concrete, the way a stairwell holds sound.
Et imagined nothing else. Imagination is dangereux.
He stuck to paper. They knocked on the Brooklyn door on a Tuesday morning. The man who answered was older than his file suggested, time having rearranged his face. He listened, expression unreadable, as they explained why they were there. He said he'd lived there forever. He said he'd had nothing to do with anything. He said a lot. Words are easy. Hands are not. At the station, he gave prints without complaint. Routine, he called it. The expert compared them to the enhanced partial. It wasn't a perfect alignment. It was something else, an echo, a correspondence that refused to resolve cleanly. She wrote a report that did not overstate. She never did. Consistent with, she wrote. Language as careful as a surgeon's hand. The district attorney reviewed the file and shook her head. Consistent with is not enough. Not now. Not after Elaine. The bar had been raised by the very case that reopened the room. Justice sharpens its tools and dulls them at the same time.
The detective understood.
He closed the file without closing the question. Some cases move forward in inches, some in circles. He added the man's name to a watch list and moved on, the way you move on from a door that won't open today. Meanwhile, the defendant in Elaine's case settled into prison life. He gave an interview to a small magazine, claiming innocence, describing the fingerprint as contamination, coincidence, conspiracy. He spoke calmly, practiced. He said he had been forgotten once and would be forgotten again. The words circulated briefly and sank. The city had heard enough. Elaine's sister avoided the article. She focused on ordinary things, grocery lists, bus schedules, the way light changed across her living room. She volunteered at a victims' advocacy group, answering phones, listening to voices tremble through the line. She did not tell them it would be okay. She told them they were not alone. That was truer. At a symposium on forensic ethics, the fingerprint expert presented Elaine's case without names. She talked about standards, about bias, about the responsibility that comes with technological power. A student asked if she ever worried about being wrong. The expert smiled, thinly. Every day, she said. That's the job. Back in the evidence room, the detective found a box mislabeled 1982 that clearly belonged to 1974. Inside, among reports and photographs, was a single latent print card with no case attached. No notes.
Just a smudge and a date.
He stared at it longer than necessary. Or maybe exactly long enough. He sent it to the lab with a note that said only, "Worth a look." The expert scanned it, adjusted, sighed. Then she adjusted again.
A rich brock free from the noise, then another.
She ran it. The system paused. When it responded, she felt the now familiar jolt. A hit. Not local. Not recent. A man arrested in 1991 for an unrelated offense, prints taken then, sitting in a database that did not exist when the card was inked. The detective read the name and felt the weight shift again. The date on the card predated the arrest by 17 years. Whatever this print belonged to, it belonged to a man who would not be on anyone's radar at the time. He traced the timeline, connecting dots without drawing lines too early. He pulled arrest reports, addresses, associates. The man had lived in the city in the mid-70s. He had worked nights. He had a record of violence that started later, as if the city had taught him something and then recorded the lesson. They tracked him down in a nursing facility upstate, body failing, mind intermittently sharp. He denied remembering anything. Then he paused. Memory is not a switch. It is a tide. He said he remembered the city being different. He said he remembered stairwells. He said he remembered nothing else. The case did not move quickly after that. Medical evaluations.
Légale consultation.
Families to notify, carefully, without promises.
The detective felt the familiar rush.
Progress without resolution is its own kind of suspense. The city kept moving. Buses ran.
Sirençant.
In apartments and offices, people talked about cold cases the way they talk about weather, concerned, briefly, then distracted. But beneath the noise, the work continued, steady and unglamorous. Late one evening, the detective stood alone in his office, the board crowded with names, arrows tentative, questions honest. Elaine's photograph was no longer there. Her case had found its ending. Others had not. He turned off the light and let the room go dark, trusting that darkness did not mean absence. It meant waiting. Because waiting is what the city does best. It waits for answers to surface, for voices to find courage, for ink to speak again. And sometimes, when patience meets persistence, the past answers, not loudly, not cleanly, but enough to remind everyone listening that silence is not the same thing as nothing. The city's patience is not infinite, but it is deep. It absorbs revelations the way asphalt absorbs heat, storing them, radiating them back long after the sun has set. After the nursing facility interview, the hum changed again. Not louder. Sharper. Files that had slept without dreams were touched with new intent. The detective felt it in the way calls were returned faster, in the way assistants lingered after meetings as if reluctant to let the air cool. The man from the nursing facility drifted between lucidity and fog. On good days, he could place himself on streets that no longer existed, storefronts replaced by glass and steel. On bad days, he asked what year it was and whether the Yankees were still playing at the old stadium. Memory played tricks, but the print did not. The print sat on its card like a stubborn truth, indifferent to time, waiting to be told what it meant. They reconstructed his life in the 70s with the care of archaeologists. Employment records, union cards, rent receipts. He had worked maintenance in several buildings downtown, keys jangling at his belt, access unnoticed because it was supposed to be there.
Access is the quietest weapon.
It leaves no mark until it does. The detective walked those buildings now, decades later, feeling the echo in his feet. Stairwells still smelled the same, metal, dust, old paint. He counted steps. He imagined a hand on a rail, a pause, a decision made in the absence of witnesses. The city teaches its lessons in places like these, places everyone uses and no one watches. A retired building superintendent remembered him. The name took effort, but the face came back easily enough. Quiet, he said.
Always around.
Quiet is the most dangerous adjective. Quiet means you don't notice when it changes. The partial print from the winter night of 1976 sat in the lab again, re-examined with a new name in mind. Enhancement techniques had improved even since the first revisit. The expert worked slowly, aware that speed lies. She layered filters, adjusted angles, let the image rest, returned to it with fresh eyes. The ridge flow aligned more convincingly now. Not perfect.
Nothing everis.
But the correspondence deepened. She wrote another careful report. Language precise. Confidence measured. High degree of similarity, she concluded. Words chosen like steps across thin ice. The district attorney read it and felt the pressure she had come to recognize as the city's breath on her neck. Elaine's case had raised expectations. Raised stakes. She convened a panel, external reviewers, skeptics by design. They argued into the evening, debating thresholds and ethics, the cost of certainty and the danger of delay. No one mentioned closure. Closure is a word people use when they want an ending without consequence. Families were notified again, gently. The sister of the woman from the stairwell sat with her hands folded and listened. She had learned how to listen. She asked questions that mattered. She did not ask for promises. When she left, she paused at the door, turned back, and said only, "Thank you for not forgetting." Gratitude can be heavier than anger. The man from Brooklyn, consistent with but not enough, felt the net tighten in a different way. He heard whispers, saw his name on a list that wasn't public. He hired a lawyer who told him what lawyers always tell their clients: say nothing, do nothing, wait. Waiting is a strategy when time is on your side. It rarely is. The defendant from Elaine's case appealed again, this time on procedural grounds. The appeal stalled, then failed. He was moved to a different facility. His interview faded from memory. The city does not hold grudges, it holds records. A new tip came in, this one digital, anonymous. A username with no history sent a message that read like a confession without verbs. Places. Dates. A staircase. The detective printed it out and circled the staircase. It matched one of the buildings the nursing facility man had worked in. Coincidence stacked upon coincidence begins to resemble design. They traced the IP to a public library upstate. Cameras showed a woman in her 30s, hair pulled back, face set. She used the computer for 7 minutes, left without checking out a book. When they found her, she said she was the man's daughter. She said she had been a child when he worked nights. She said she remembered his hands smelling like metal and bleach. She said she had found a box in the attic after her mother died. The box contained keys, old and labeled in a careful hand. Not proof.
Note confession.
Context. The detective held one key between his fingers, felt its cold certainty.
Keys open things.
They also closed them. The daughter did not want publicity.
She wanted quiet.
She wanted the city to do what it does best when it is not being watched. The district attorney agreed. Quiet work yields truer results. They tested the keys against surviving locks where possible, consulted blueprints where it wasn't. Some fit. Some didn't. Enough did to raise the temperature of the room. The nursing facility man's health declined. He slept more. When awake, he spoke less. They recorded what they could, mindful of ethics, mindful of time. He said once, softly, that the city was loud then. He said he had liked the stairwells because they were quiet. Quiet again. The lab cross-checked the enhanced prints against newer databases, international ones now accessible.
No contradictions emerged.
Consistency piled up like evidence does when it decides to be heavy. The panel reconvened. The debate was shorter this time.
Still careful.
Still cautious. But momentum is not a feeling, it is a sequence of decisions aligning. The district attorney authorized a move, not an arrest, not yet, but a formal designation that allowed deeper digging, subpoenas, interviews that carry weight. The Brooklyn man's lawyer called, indignant. The detective listened, took notes, thanked him for his time. Indignation is a performance. Evidence is not. At the victim's advocacy office, Elaine's sister fielded a call from a woman who recognized the staircase from the news. She described a man she'd seen once years ago, standing too still. Memory again.
Fragile. Dangereux.
Necessary. The detective walked home late, city lights blurring in the drizzle. He thought about stairwells and keys, about daughters and sisters, about how violence leaves ripples that outlive perpetrators. He thought about the responsibility that comes with hearing the past speak. The case did not resolve that week. Or the next. It edged forward, as cases do when they have learned patience from the city.
Paperwork thickened.
Timelines refined. Doubts addressed. Each answered question exposed another. In the nursing facility, the man's eyes opened one afternoon and focused. He asked for water. He asked for his daughter. He said a name he hadn't said before.
The detective Lindin, at steady, pen ready.
The name was a building superintendent from 1975, long dead. A man who would not answer questions. A man whose silence had been complete. The detective wrote it down anyway. Silence is still a data point. When the man passed weeks later, the city noted it with a brief line in a ledger. Another life ended. Another set of answers narrowed. The case did not die with him. It rarely does. The district attorney stood at her window and watched traffic inch along. She weighed what could be proven against what was known. She chose caution again, because caution is not cowardice, it is respect for consequences. The fingerprint expert filed her final report on the stairwell case. She added an addendum, rare for her. Given the totality of evidence, she wrote, the probability of random correspondence is exceedingly low. Exceedingly low is as close to certainty as science allows without lying. The detective pinned the addendum to the board. He stepped back. The city exhaled, almost imperceptibly. Somewhere, a staircase held its breath. Morning arrived without ceremony, a thin gray light sliding between buildings, finding dust on windowsills, settling into corners where secrets prefer to wait.
The case walk with it.
Phones rang earlier now. Emails stacked before coffee cooled. Momentum does that, it changes the posture of a room.
People lean forward.
The detective returned to the board and saw not chaos but structure. Names had gravitated toward each other. Dates aligned like vertebrae. The staircase buildings formed a corridor through time, a route walked again and again by a man whose life had been defined by keys and quiet. The board did not accuse. It suggested. It asked questions with patience sharpened by years. The district attorney authorized a limited press acknowledgement. Not details. Not triumph. Just a sentence confirming renewed investigative activity in a decades-old homicide. The city read it over breakfast and felt the old chill.
Col de Casse d'Odette.
They remind people that time is not a shield. The daughter kept her distance. She answered questions through counsel, precise and contained. Grief has many shapes, hers was controlled, a box within a box. She provided school records, letters, photographs that placed her father in rooms and routines. He was present in her childhood, she said. He cooked.
Et fixed things.
He never raised his voice. Monsters, if they exist, rarely announce themselves. The lab ran another test, touched DNA from a piece of evidence that had once seemed useless. A scrap of fabric preserved more out of habit than hope. Technology had caught up to patience. The sample yielded partial markers. Not enough to convict. Enough to compare.
Enough tout complicat.
The markers did not contradict the fingerprint alignment. They whispered the same name without saying it aloud. Science does not shout. It accumulates. The detective visited one of the buildings again, this time with a structural engineer. They traced lines through blueprints, calculated angles of sight, sound travel. They stood in the stairwell and spoke at normal volume. The sound died quickly. The engineer nodded. Good place to not be heard, he said, not thinking about what that meant. Outside, the city had changed the block. A cafe where a newsstand had been.
A bankware hardware store on sold keys.
Progress does not erase, it layers. Beneath it, the past holds. A retired officer agreed to talk, his memory triggered by the press acknowledgement. He had worked patrol in the 70s, responded to a call near one of the stairwells the night before the murder. Noise complaint. He remembered a man carrying a toolbox, head down. He remembered thinking nothing of it. He had thought of it since. Memory again, unreliable but persistent. The detective listened, asked careful questions, wrote down what could be written. He did not correct the man when he conflated dates. He did not interrupt when the story wandered. He waited for the truth to surface the way it often does, sideways. The district attorney convened a grand jury briefing, not to indict, not yet, but to test the water, to hear the evidence spoken aloud. Spoken evidence behaves differently. It reveals weaknesses.
It demande clarity.
They rehearsed. The fingerprint expert practiced explaining ridge characteristics to people who would never love them the way she did. The DNA analyst practiced saying probabilistic genotyping without losing the room. The detective practiced telling the story without telling it, presenting facts without guiding conclusions. The law does not permit guidance. It permits patience. Across town, the Brooklyn man watched the news and felt his name hover in the air like dust. He told his lawyer he was tired of waiting. The lawyer told him waiting was safer than talking. He nodded and did neither. He called an old friend, then hung up without leaving a message. Silence again, as data. The victims' families gathered quietly, some meeting for the first time. They shared photographs, artifacts of lives interrupted. They shared what the city had never given them, context. In that room, time folded. The 70s were not distant. They were present, sharp. Elaine's sister spoke last. She spoke about hope as a discipline, not a feeling.
The room understood.
The grand jury briefing began with the staircase. The detective described it not as a place of violence, but as a place of movement. He described how movement creates opportunity. He described keys and access, maintenance schedules and blind spots. He described how a fingerprint can survive time if time leaves it alone. The fingerprint expert took over, hand steady, voice calm. She showed overlays, explained why similarity is not sameness and why sameness is not required. She said exceedingly low probability, and let the phrase sit. She did not oversell. She did not need to. The DNA analyst followed, careful with language, clear about limitations. Science earns trust by admitting what it cannot do. The district attorney closed by reminding the jurors that the case was old but the law was current. That justice does not expire. That caution honors both victims and defendants. She did not ask for anything. She said thank you. Afterward, the room felt lighter, not relieved but aligned. The city had taken a step without tripping. Another anonymous message arrived that evening. This one shorter.
Check the locker.
No context. No signature. The detective traced it to a transit hub, cameras inconclusive. He went anyway. The locker room belonged to a building long since renovated, now a shared storage space. They searched with permission, inventorying decades of forgotten items. In a dented metal locker, they found a pair of gloves, brittle with age.
Inside one, a fin ridge impression cooked the light.
The lab worked overnight. The ridge was partial, degraded, but enough to suggest consistency.
Another whisper.
The district attorney did not sleep. She weighed the whispers, the ethics, the risk of confirmation bias. She convened her internal skeptics again. They argued until dawn, then argued some more. The decision did not come easily. It rarely should. At sunrise, she authorized a warrant for the locker contents only. Narrow. Surgical.
The law préfère restreint.
The warrant yielded nothing else of note. Sometimes a whisper is only that. The detective accepted it without disappointment. He had learned to value negative space. The Brooklyn man's lawyer requested a meeting. He said his client wanted to clarify misunderstandings. Clarifications are rarely clarifying. The district attorney agreed, with conditions. The interview room was plain. The man was older than his file suggested, shoulders rounded by time. He answered questions politely, deflected others with practiced vagueness. When asked about stairwells, he smiled thinly. Everyone uses stairs, he said. True. Not helpful. The detective slid a photograph across the table, a blueprint with dates circled. The man's smile faltered. Not gone. Thinner. The interview ended without fireworks.
No confession.
No outburst. Just a record of what was said and what was not. Outside, the city continued. It always does. Children walked to school past buildings that had learned to keep secrets. Tourists photographed facades that had once watched violence pass without comment. The detective updated the board again. He felt the case breathing, slow and steady. He felt the weight of years and the fragility of the present. That night, he dreamed of stairwells, endless and echoing. He woke before dawn with a sentence in his head, something the retired officer had said. He was carrying a toolbox. Tools. Keys. Access. Quiet. He went back to the evidence room and requested a re-examination of the toolbox inventory from a different case in 1975, one that had never connected. The clerk raised an eyebrow, then complied. Curiosity is contagious. The inventory listed a brand discontinued in 1974, sold regionally. The purchase records led to a store, then a ledger, then a name.
Note the Brooklyn Man. Another maintenance worker. Another key life.
The board shifted. The corridor widened. The city leaned in again. Cold cases do not resolve in straight lines. They spiral, drawing closer with each turn. As Part 8 closed, the spiral tightened, and the staircase, patient and indifferent, waited for the next footstep. The new name did not arrive with fanfare. It slid onto the board like a shadow joining other shadows, another quiet life intersecting a violent night. The detective stared at it longer than the rest, not because it felt right, but because it felt dangerous.
Cold case punish certainty.
They reward doubt that knows where to look. The maintenance workers' records were thin, yellowed invoices and time cards stamped with dates that bled into each other. He had worked nights. He had worked alone. He had moved between buildings with a familiarity that never triggered alarms. Access is not suspicion, but in a case built on access, it becomes gravity. The city breathed around the investigation, unaware of the recalibration happening in windowless rooms. Subway trains rattled past walls that had heard screams once and forgotten them. The detective followed the paper trail into the borough archives, where basements smell like damp cardboard and patience. He found a permit application with a smudged thumbprint, too degraded to be useful, the archivist said. Maybe, the detective thought, not anymore. The lab disagreed. Technology had learned to coax ghosts into focus. The thumbprint yielded a fragment, again, not enough to stand alone, enough to compare. The comparison did not match the Brooklyn Man. It brushed the edge of the new name, grazing but not confirming.
Another whisper, another fork in the spiral.
The district attorney convened another meeting, smaller this time. Fewer voices, sharper questions. They talked about reasonable doubt, about narrative risk, about the danger of chasing patterns that mirror themselves. She asked the detective to slow down. He nodded and did not. He drove to the neighborhood where the maintenance worker had lived in 1975. The building was gone, replaced by a parking lot with faded lines. He stood there anyway. Place matters even when it no longer exists.
Neighbor remembé absent sa muche à présence.
An elderly woman recalled a man who kept odd hours, polite, forgettable. She remembered because forgettable men are easier to recall once they stop being there. He had moved suddenly, she said. No forwarding address. That detail had not made it into any file. The detective traced the move through utility records and found a rural address upstate, then another farther west. A life in motion without explanation. He requested death records and received confirmation that the maintenance worker had died in the late 90s, buried under a stone with no epitaph. Closure without answers is not closure at all. The lab finished its work on the locker gloves. The ridge impression aligned better with the deceased maintenance worker than with the Brooklyn Man, but alignment is not identity. The probability was significant.
Note conclusive.
Science again refused to shout. The district attorney weighed the calculus of naming a dead suspect publicly. It carries relief and risk. It ends one story while beginning another. Families deserve truth, but truth is a heavy word when certainty is partial. She delayed. Meanwhile, the Brooklyn Man sensed the shift. His lawyer noticed it first, the cadence of calls, the absence of urgency. Being deprioritized feels like relief until it feels like insult. He requested another meeting. The district attorney declined. The detective returned to the stairwell buildings and walked them again, this time with a different set of eyes. Maintenance workers leave marks others do not notice, scratches near panels, screws replaced with mismatched heads. He found one, then another, consistent across buildings, a signature of habit. He photographed them and sent them to the lab for toolmark analysis. The results came back tentative but suggestive. The screws bore marks consistent with a tool from the discontinued brand listed in the inventory. Suggestive is not satisfying. It is dangerous. Elaine's sister asked for an update. The district attorney chose her words carefully. She spoke of progress without promise, of leads without conclusions. The sister listened, then asked a question that cut through caution. Is he alive? The answer was no. Relief flickered and died. Justice does not require a pulse, but it prefers one. A reporter caught wind of the deceased suspect and published a speculative piece. The district attorney issued a statement reminding the public that speculation harms investigations and families. The city argued online anyway.
Cold case invite opinion, the way open wound invite touch.
The detective felt the pressure tighten. He dreamed again of stairwells, this time with two figures passing each other, indistinct. He woke with a detail nagging him, keys. Not possession, but duplication. He pulled old locksmith invoices from the files and noticed a pattern, multiple rekeying jobs following minor incidents, always handled by maintenance, not contractors.
Control of access, again.
He tracked down a retired locksmith who remembered nothing until he remembered everything. He described a man who insisted on keeping spare keys, just in case. The locksmith had refused. The man had smiled and gone elsewhere. The locksmith could not recall a name. He recalled the smile. The lab delivered another report. A fiber found on Elaine's clothing matched insulation used in stairwell repairs during that period. Widely used, yes. Present in many places, yes. But combined with access, habit, tool marks, and a partial print, the picture sharpened without becoming clear.
The district attorney assembled the skeptic again.
They argued into the night. One insisted the Brooklyn man had motive others lacked. Another argued that motive is a narrative luxury. A third warned against posthumous blame. The district attorney listened until the room quieted. She asked a simple question. What can we prove? Silence answered. Proof was fragmented, probabilistic, persuasive but not definitive.
The law does not punish persuasion.
The detective pushed once more, driven by a sense that the case was trying to tell him something he was missing. He reread the original witness statements and noticed a phrase repeated by two unrelated witnesses. He smelled like oil. Not grease. Oil.
Maintenant soil.
He pulled the inventory again and found a note about a specific brand used by the deceased maintenance worker, discontinued after an environmental recall.
Rare by the time of the murder.
The lab-tested residue preserved on a piece of fabric, long ignored.
The chemical signature aligned with the oil. Alignement again.
The spiral tightened further. The district attorney made a decision. She would not charge. She would not name publicly. Instead, she would present findings to the families and issue a report acknowledging a likely suspect without legal declaration. It was an unsatisfying compromise. It was the only honest one. The meeting with the families was quiet, heavy. The district attorney spoke plainly, avoided euphemism. She explained probability and limitation. She did not hide behind jargon. Elaine's sister asked if the man had ever been questioned. He had not. The system had not looked. The room absorbed that failure without comment. Afterward, the detective walked alone. The city offered no absolution. Cold cases rarely do. He returned to the board one last time and removed the Brooklyn man's photograph, then placed the maintenance worker's name at the center with a question mark beside it.
Question de zéro respect.
A final anonymous message arrived weeks later.
No demande, no accusation.
Just coordinates. The detective went with a search team and found a shallow depression near a decommissioned rail spur, disturbed earth that time had tried to smooth. They dug and found nothing but rusted metal and old bottles. Sometimes a message is a memory, not a map. The case closed administratively with an asterisk. Solved in probability. Unresolved in law. The city moved on, or pretended to. Stairwells continued to echo with ordinary footsteps. The detective archived his notes and kept one photograph on his desk, the staircase, empty, indifferent. He understood now that cold cases are less about answers than about refusing to forget the questions. As Part 9 faded, the spiral slowed but did not stop. The forgotten fingerprint had broken decades of silence, but silence has layers. Beneath the noise of progress, beneath the comfort of likely truths, the unanswered hum remained, low and persistent, waiting for whoever would listen next.
Silencis never anti.
It carries weight, pressure, memory. After the case was administratively closed, after files were stamped and shelved, after statements were carefully worded and released into the city's bloodstream, the silence changed. It thickened. It settled into places where sound used to live.
The staircase still existed.
That was the cruelest detail. The building had not been demolished. It had not burned or collapsed. Tenants still climbed those steps every day, groceries in hand, headphones on, eyes down. They walked through a crime scene without knowing it, or knowing and refusing to feel it. New paint covered old stains. New railings replaced the ones that once caught a stranger's grip. But the geometry was unchanged. Rise. Run. Turn.
Landing. Shadow.
The detective returned there one final time, not officially, not logged. He stood at the bottom and looked up.
Col de Casse d'Odis.
They pull you back to places that do not ask for you but accept you anyway. He closed his eyes and listened. The building breathed differently now. Modern pipes. Different footsteps.
No echo of panique. No audible memory.
And yet his chest tightened as if the night had folded itself and waited. The district attorney felt a different silence. Hers arrived in the form of emails that stopped coming. Press inquiries dried up. Advocacy groups turned their attention elsewhere. Momentum dissipated. She had known this would happen. Justice, when it cannot be declared cleanly, rarely holds the spotlight.
Stille, the caboteur.
It felt unfinished in a way paperwork could not soothe.
Chirirait the final report à l'on.
Words like probable, consistent with, likely repeated like cautious footfalls. No sentence crossed the line into certainty. That was the point. And yet every paragraph leaned in the same direction, like grass pressed by wind. She wondered if history would be kinder than the present, if future technology would find what this moment could not. Elaine's sister returned to her routine with an altered rhythm. Closure is a myth told to comfort the living. What she felt was not closure but containment. The pain fit differently now. It no longer flared unpredictably. It sat, steady and heavy, like a stone in her pocket. She could carry it. That was something. She visited the grave of a man she had never known, the maintenance worker with the quiet life and the suspicious access. She stood at a respectful distance, unsure what etiquette applied when grief intersects with accusation. She did not curse him. She did not forgive him. She acknowledged him as a node in a story that had swallowed years. Then she left, feeling neither better nor worse, only clearer. The Brooklyn man watched the city forget him again.
Relief mingled with bitterness.
Being suspected had scarred him in ways exoneration could not heal. He had lost friends, opportunities, sleep. He had lived under a cloud that never quite rained. When the focus shifted away, he expected gratitude to arrive. It did not. What arrived was anger. Not at the investigators, but at the randomness of suspicion, the way proximity becomes guilt when answers are scarce. The detective filed his last memo and shut down the board. Photographs came down. Strings fell limp.
The center entied.
He left the question mark on the maintenance worker's name until the end, then removed it and placed it in a folder labeled Unresolved. He did not erase it. He archived it. There is a difference. Months passed. Seasons turned. Snow fell and melted in the stairwell's corners.
The city found new stories to obsess over.
But cold cases have a way of resurfacing, not as news, but as unease. A graduate student researching historical forensic methods requested access to the evidence for an academic paper. The request passed through channels and landed on the district attorney's desk. She hesitated, then approved it with conditions. Sometimes fresh eyes see patterns old eyes accept. The student focused on the fingerprint. Not the ridge pattern, but the substrate. The surface it had been left on. The oil. The dust.
The microabrasion.
She compared it with modern databases of environmental contaminants and manufacturing processes. She found a match more specific than anyone had before, not to a person, but to a place. A workshop that serviced tools for municipal buildings in the 70s. A place the maintenance worker had frequented. The finding did not change the legal status of the case. It changed the emotional math. The detective read the student's paper and felt the familiar tightening. The spiral had slowed, but it had not stopped. It never does. He visited the workshop, now a cafe with exposed brick and Edison bulbs. History repurposed. He ordered coffee and sat where benches once stood. He imagined hands covered in oil, fingers pressed against metal, prints left without intention. Evidence does not know when it is being made. It waits. The district attorney added an addendum to the report. It was careful. It was restrained. It leaned no harder than before. But the direction was unmistakable. The maintenance worker's name, once a whisper, became a footnote with gravity. Elaine's sister received the update and felt the stone in her pocket shift. Heavier, perhaps, but smoother. She wrote a letter she did not send, addressed to no one in particular. It said what official language could not. It named the loss. It named the time stolen. It named the strange mercy of being believed without being satisfied. The detective dreamed less often. When he did, the stairwell was empty. That, too, felt like progress. On the anniversary of the murder, a small memorial appeared at the base of the building. No one claimed responsibility. A candle. A photograph. A note folded until its words pressed into themselves. We remember. The city paused for a moment, then continued. Cold cases do not end with handcuffs. They end with choices. To look again. To stop. To speak carefully. To leave space for what may still be learned. This one ended with a report and a quiet agreement among those closest to it. The truth was near enough to touch, but not to hold. Years later, technology would advance again. Algorithms would improve. Archives would digitize. Someone somewhere might run the data anew and find a certainty where probability once lived. Or they might not. Both outcomes exist simultaneously until one collapses into fact. For now, the forgotten fingerprint had done what it could. It had cracked the silence, not shattered it. It had shifted the story's weight from nowhere to somewhere. It had honored the victim by insisting she not be lost to ambiguity. The detective closed his eyes and listened to the city. It hummed with unresolved stories. This one was among them, quieter now, but present. A reminder that justice is not a switch to be flipped, but a process that sometimes stops just short of the finish line. And in that space, between knowing and proving, between memory and record, the cold case lived on, no longer invisible, never fully solved, but no longer forgotten.